Welcome back. It is still 2019, but for the next couple of segments, we're going to look at the 2020 election. In a few minutes, we'll focus in on the Democratic primary. But in this segment, we talk with a professor who has accurately predicted every presidential election since 1984 to talk about this president and this race. And he says impeachment is making things very interesting for how 2020 will play out. Joining us now, Allan Lichtman. He's a political historian who's a professor at American University. He's also the author of The Case for Impeachment. Allan, I'll ask you about the impact of impeachment in just a moment, but all signs point to a very close 2020 election. I'm sure you're familiar with the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia and their electoral college ratings. Right now, they have the race at 248 to 248 with just three pure toss-up states and one district in Nebraska that could possibly decide the election. I know you use a different formula, but from what you see, do you also think this is going to be a very close election next November?
There is no question that this is going to be an extremely close election. My prediction system, the 13 keys to the White House, has correctly called every election since 1984. And the way it works is if 6 or more keys go against the party holding the White House, in this case, the incumbent Republicans, they lose. Fewer than 6, they're predicted to win. Right now, we're about 4 to 5 keys down. That's how close it is, and there's still a lot of keys that could change between now and November. In the age of Trump, things can change overnight.
So, Allan, how would Trump be looking for re-election without impeachment in the mix?
Well, you know, Trump is kind of whistling past the graveyard, thinking that impeachment is going to help him by solidifying his base. But if you look at history, you look at all presidents who've been impeached and Richard Nixon, who resigned to avoid impeachment, their party lost the next presidential election. Andrew Johnson's Democrats lost in 1868. Of course, Richard Nixon's Republicans lost in 1976. And Bill Clinton's Democrats lost in 2000 in an election they otherwise should easily have won absent the scandal at a time of peace, prosperity, and domestic and foreign tranquility. And by the way, the scandal key is one of the keys that impeachment has now turned against Trump's reelection, although, as I said, the election is still hanging fire.
And I know that you think that impeachment will weigh on the scandal factor against the president, but as part of his defense, Trump and his allies keep focusing on Hunter Biden and Ukraine, trying to fan the flames and turn that into a scandal as well. Is it possible that that could even out come November with impeachment as one factor and Hunter Biden and Ukraine on the other if Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee?
Look, Trump just makes things up that he thinks is going to help him, including big lies like he knew nothing about the payoffs to the porn star and the former Playboy model who alleged affairs with him, when in fact he directed those payments, or the lie that Barack Obama wiretapped his phone. Now he's peddling the lie that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden did something wrong in the Ukraine, when in fact what Joe Biden did was get rid of a corrupt prosecutor who wasn't prosecuting anything, including the company on which Hunter Biden stood as a board member, and he did it with the support of the entire U.S. government, our European allies, and the IMF. So this notion that there is some scandal involving the Bidens is just another fabrication of Donald Trump, but that won't stop him from propagating it from now to the end of the campaign, just as he'll propagate any lies that he think will help them.
Of the 13 factors that you use in your formula, only one is focused on the opponent of the incumbent. The rest center on, in this case, the president and how the nation is doing. That one opponent factor is challenger charisma, whether the challenger is not charismatic or a national hero. I'm curious, which of the Democratic candidates in your mind would fare well on that factor? Is Joe Biden a national hero? Is Bernie Sanders charismatic? What about Warren or Buttigieg or Bloomberg?
You know, right now, I don't see any of the Democrats emerging to win the challenger charisma key, or in effect, to turn it against the incumbent Republicans. Joe Biden is not a national hero. He's not a Dwight Eisenhower who led us through war. Bernie Sanders is charismatic in the sense that he appeals to a certain narrow base in the electorate, kind of like Donald Trump does on the other side, but not broadly appealing to the electorate like, say, a Franklin Roosevelt or a Ronald Reagan was. But we don't have a nominee yet. And who knows, the person who gets to be the nominee may rise to the occasion and become inspirational. But right now, I think it's a long shot for that key to turn against President Trump.
I wonder if there's a flip side, though, to the charisma factor. I mean, nobody, not even his worst critics, would argue that Donald Trump is not charismatic, but his charisma is often a vessel for his worst impulses and behaviors. Is that a factor in your formula? Can charisma become a negative for Donald Trump, or is he essentially a lock to win the charisma contest?
No, charisma can never be a negative because, as I explained, as I define it in the book, and you have to buy my book, Predicting the Next President, to understand all of this, charisma means you transcend partisan lines to an extent and do appeal broadly across the American electorate. Remember, the conventional wisdom was that Ronald Reagan couldn't win in 1980 because he was too far right, and yet he diffused that charge with his inspirational, charismatic appeal, the way the non-inspirational Barry Goldwater could not do against Lyndon Johnson in 1964 when he was tagged with being a far-right radical. The reason I don't give Trump the key, though, is unlike Reagan, he has never transcended his narrow base. In fact, the most recent approval polls put him right around 40%, towards the low end of where he stood during his presidency.
I just want to pick your brain on a couple of the other factors in your formula. One of them is social unrest. I'm not sure if I would consider us to be in a period of social unrest as 2020 begins. We've seen lots of marches and protests, but we've also seen lots of pro-Trump marches and protests too. Do you consider the nation to be amidst social unrest?
No, I've not turned the social unrest key against Donald Trump. Certainly there have been sporadic protests, but nothing like the protests and riots of the 1960s and early 1970s that put Americans in fear that their nation really was being violently ripped apart. Of course, that doesn't mean there could not be such decisive protests following an acquittal of Donald Trump in the impeachment trial, particularly if the Republicans tried to rig the trial by denying the appearance of any witnesses or the calling of any documents, contrary to the precedent set in the trials of Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton.
Finally, Allan, you have the economy in your formula twice, short-term and long-term, with specific benchmarks like recession and per capita economic growth. But the economy is also somewhat personal. It's not just about the wider trends and the numbers, but how people feel about the economy and if they feel like they're benefiting from it. I'm just wondering, is the economy a factor that can be subject to persuasion during the campaign? Can Democrats successfully argue that, boy, the economy is worse for a lot of working people than the stock market or the unemployment rate would indicate?
Absolutely. I think the Democrats could try. Look, in the election of 1992, the recession had technically ended, but the National Bureau of Economic Research did not call the end of the recession until well after the election. And most Americans still felt that the economy was indeed in recession. I think it's going to be a tough call for the Democrats in 2020 to persuade the people that, in effect, despite some positive numbers for ordinary Americans, really had a recession. And of course, that could very much depend on what happens to the economy in 2020. There could well be a slide in the economy, which would make the Democrats' persuasive task much easier.
Allan Lichtman has a long history of successfully predicting the winner of presidential elections, so I suspect we will be talking with him throughout 2020. Allan, thanks so much. Happy New Year. Appreciate it.
Happy New Year to you, and the election's still hanging fire, so there's plenty to talk about.
And up next on RFL, we're now just a little more than a month away from the Iowa caucuses, and we're seeing a rift in the Democratic Party between the progressives and the moderates, and it's a battle about money. We'll explain right after this.